Battlefield 6 is just weeks away from release, and I, like many others, am curious as to whether it's going to be any good or not from the perspective of big fans of the Battlefield franchise. Sales-wise, I'm sure it'll do fine, but lots of sales doesn't always mean an outstanding product, especially for AAA titles. Since we have nothing else to do while we wait, I figured I'd do some speculation and prediction on how things might shake out, including a short history lesson on DICE/EA, stuff that could have an effect on Battlefield 6 as well as future titles in the series. If you weren't following gaming industry news in 2018, you may have missed some pretty big news regarding top executives at DICE/EA. Conveniently, I was working on a video about DICE over a year ago that I shelved for various reasons, but I still have a lot of the research that I did on that video. So to fill you in late 2018, the former CEO of DICE and executive vice president at EA, Patrick Soderlund, as well as a bunch of other executives, left EA to form a new studio called Embark. About 4 years later, which would be 2 years ago, Embark would go on to release a game you may or may not have heard of called The Finals, which, if you haven't heard of, is what I would describe as a tournament/round-based battle royale. They are also set to release an extraction shooter called Arc Raiders at the end of October, if that's interesting to you. I won't get too sidetracked on this, but if you really want to get into details on the history of DICE and this new studio Embark, let me know in the comments and I will gladly revive that project. There's a lot of interesting info there. Anyways, here's the list of those executives who left DICE for Embark. Of course, we've got Patrick Soderlund, the former CEO of DICE and executive vice president at EA, Magnus Nordin, former technical director at EA and head of research at EA's Search for Extraordinary Experiences division, aka SEED, which is essentially EA's research and development department. We've got Rob Runeson, former chief content officer at DICE, Stefan Stromberg, former creative director at DICE, Jenny Holzscheiner, former senior communications director at DICE and senior director of brand and corporate communications at EA, and Johan Andersen, former vice president and creator of Seed. Now, if you thought that wasn't enough, Embark also hired quite a few experienced ex-DICE employees, at least 34 that I could count, most of whom had many years of experience at DICE. These hirings didn't happen all at once, but of the ones I did find, most happened in 2018 or 2019, so shortly after they started Embark. Following the departures of these key people, in 2020, Vince Zampella was put in charge of the DICE Los Angeles division, which, from what I can tell, is actually not really related to DICE, but was more of a support team up to this point, opened by EA back in 2013. With Zampella in charge, DICE LA planned to separate themselves from DICE, the main department over in Sweden, and renamed to Ripple Effect Studios in 2021. Another side note, if you don't know Vince Zampella, he was a founder at Respawn Entertainment, who you might know as the creators of the Titanfall franchise and Apex Legends, and Zampella was a co-founder of Infinity Ward, working at the company for many of the early Call of Duty games. Basically, industry veteran, knows what he's doing, has put out many successful games, so it makes sense for EA to put him in charge. Now, as far as I can tell, DICE LA/Zampella were not in charge of Battlefield 2042's development, as EA would name Zampella as the overseer of the franchise moving forward after 2042's underwhelming performance. Of course, 2042's failures weren't all because of lack of leadership, but I can see how a bunch of industry veterans leaving the company could affect the development cycle to some degree, and why EA is handing the reins of Battlefield to Zampella to try to get the franchise back on track ASAP. So, with that short history lesson out of the way, what can we expect from Zampella's Battlefield? The first place to look is obviously the closed/open betas and the changes EA has made following their conclusion. I'll put a link in the description to the full Reddit post going through all the changes following the open beta weekends, but essentially, EA does appear to be responding to player feedback and making gameplay adjustments that many people online were asking for. In the post, they go through the list of upcoming changes, such as weapons changes, encouraging more tap/burst firing, and a nerf to the M87A1 shotgun, and changes to movement, which is what really stands out to me, because from my experience in the open beta, movement felt really fast-paced, similar to Apex Legends, which some may theorize as being related to Vince Zampella's leadership, who, as I just mentioned, founded the company that made Apex Legends and Titanfall. That's really just wild speculation, though. There's not really any solid info to back that theory up, as far as I know. In any case, back to movement. It felt very fast-paced in the beta, and from some of the clips out there, it's obviously dialed up a bit too far. In particular, the Battlefield team mentions changes to momentum, jumping, and sliding in an effort to make sliding and jumping more situational, so they are no longer ideal options for engaging in gunfights and will contribute to a gameplay pace that rewards skillful movement without becoming too fast or unpredictable. Assuming they get the details right, this should be a highly beneficial change, and one of the most important. Battlefield historically has not been a game about outmaneuvering the enemy, at least not in a who can move around the most unpredictably fashion. Moving on, though, the other big thing to talk about that's coming for Battlefield 6 is the Battle Royale mode. This mode has been rumored for quite some time, but was officially announced about a week ago from the time of me recording this, with EA giving some details on what we can expect. The most interesting thing to me was the class system from the main Battlefield experience being brought over to the Battle Royale mode. In their announcement, EA says that each class will bring gadgets unique to that class to the battle, and through various methods such as eliminating other players and doing side missions, players will be able to access more traits to give them an edge over the competition. It's not explicitly stated that these traits are class-specific, but I think it's safe to assume that they are. The other very interesting mechanic that they mention is the ring. In every other Battle Royale game that I know of, the ring does damage over time, but in Battlefield's BR, the ring will instantly kill you, which should be interesting to see, assuming they don't end up changing that down the line. Now, all that being said, I think at the end of the day, if you're a Battle Royale fan, you'll probably enjoy the Battlefield BR, and if you aren't a Battle Royale fan, you probably won't enjoy this one either. Sure, there'll be some people who will enjoy this BR who don't normally enjoy BRs, but I don't think EA's main goal is to convert Battle Royale haters with their own version. From what I can tell, EA seems to be hedging their bets somewhat, trying to cater to both hardcore Battlefield fans as well as the masses to try to boost sales numbers. Important to remember, EA is a publicly traded company, which means priority number one is always going to be money. Now, the biggest thing I noticed to support this push for mass appeal, besides the announcement of a Battle Royale mode, was the size of the maps in the open beta. Maybe I missed the chance to play a map, considering it was seemingly impossible to actually choose what map to play, but every map I played was tiny compared to the usual size of Battlefield maps. There's been some speculation that some of the maps are actually bigger and they just made them small for the sake of the beta, but I really don't believe that that's all there is to it. Beta tests for AAA studios, especially nowadays, while still being useful for collecting feedback and fixing bugs, are also a huge marketing asset, and it's pretty much guaranteed that EA's marketing team is well aware of this fact and had at least some oversight in how the game was presented during the beta weekends. I have seen some people say that the smaller maps are likely the most optimized, which would therefore give the best first impression, and there is some support to that theory, namely some leaks of some of the other map layouts that seem to be much larger, but you could also make the case that EA should/could have spent time working on and optimizing at least one larger map in order to get data and feedback on that size as well. This would have also placated many of the hardcore Battlefield fans, as the assumption would then be that there's at least some larger maps, rather than potentially thinking all of the maps will be as small as the beta maps. To go off script for a second here, the reason I bring up the smaller maps as evidence, as part of this mass appeal thing, is that what I think EA thinks is that the masses want smaller maps because it's more fast-paced and there's less downtime. And, the bigger maps, you would be, like, walking between objectives, and there would be some downtime there, and they're maybe pushing for the Zoomer audience or something like that. But anyways, let's get back on track. Anyways, you may be wondering, why am I bringing up this point about EA's theoretical target audience? Well, when I first started writing this video, I wanted to discuss the idea of mass appeal versus niche appeal in gaming in general. It can be a defining feature of a game's development and success. I'd say it's a bit of a give-and-take scenario. If you try to make a game that appeals to as many people as possible, you take away some of the charm of a game that was made specifically for a certain group of people. This isn't an ideal example, but look at EAFC/FIFA versus Football Manager, for example. For a large number of people, EAFC gets the job done as a sports video game that you can play to have fun or be competitive with friends or whatever. For people who want a deeper management experience, a smaller set of people, Football Manager is way more suited to those needs. Not everyone necessarily needs or wants to be able to get into the nitty-gritty of transfers and contracts or setting up complex tactics, but some people love that, me included. The interesting thing is, I bet a lot of you watching would agree that Football Manager is a better game than EAFC. However, that's really just our opinion, and someone who loves EAFC might disagree and think EAFC is way better. I've come to realize that over the years I've not enjoyed AAA games as much as I used to a decade ago, because now I'm looking for games that scratch a very particular, very specific itch that AAA titles for the most part just aren't catering to. Now, I could make a whole other video on this topic, so I won't go on for too long, but there's also a lot of other potential factors that could be in play here. Have AAA games gotten worse over time, or is it just nostalgia? Is the price increase of AAA titles justified? Etc., etc. I could go on and on about this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this sort of stuff, so please let me know in the comments what you think. Anyways, I'm just gonna go ahead and get this back to the main topic and wrap up. So, to conclude, I personally won't be buying Battlefield 6 at launch, as the price is just too high for me, for a game that I might not even end up playing that much if it turns out to be unenjoyable. However, what I will probably do, and what I'd recommend doing as an alternative to shelling out $70, is get a month of EA Play Pro, as $17 is obviously a lot easier to stomach, and EA Play Pro will include Battlefield 6 at launch, and it'll give a chance to try the game and decide if it's worth picking up in the future, especially if it goes on sale at some point. Like I said though, I haven't enjoyed AAA games as much as I used to, and I don't think Battlefield 6 will be an exception, but I'm always happy to be proven wrong. In any case, if you made it here to the end of the video, let me quickly say thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, really helps me out, and I'll see you next time.